Please welcome today's panel, moderated by Danilo Toro, Global Media Manager at P&G. Joining Danilo are Max Kalehoff, Vice President of Marketing at Realize, Amy Williams, co-founder of GoodLoop, and Joe Zawadzki, Chief Executive Officer of MediaMath.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Danilo Tauro. I'm the Global Media Manager at Procter & Gamble. I'm very excited to be here today and thankful to the Ad Club for the invite. And why excited? Because we'll be talking about the art and science of media. And I know in discussions, especially lately, often we talk about the science, so we talk about data, we talk about technology, we talk about analytics. So the question was, what about the art? What about content? What about values? What about purpose? And that's why we have today a panel with people with a very different profile that will talk about these topics, what are the intersections, and how we can look at that. So before getting started, I will let them introduce themselves.
Hi, Joe Zawadzki, CEO of MediaMath, and looking at this busy eye chart back here, realizing this represents about 20 years of my career, so I'm excited to dive into it.
Hi, my name's Amy. I'm the founder and CEO of an ethical advertising company called GoodLoop. We essentially convert ad money into funding for good causes around the world.
And I'm Max. I'm with Realize. Our mission is to make technology more human, and we do so through facial coding and computer vision.
So actually, the first question goes to Joe, and I'm actually very excited to have him here at the panel because I was sharing actually with him before. When I started to work in media, and that was 5.5 years ago, more or less, somebody told me, oh, you need to study programmatic. I was like, oh, what's programmatic? And then I remember reading stuff about Joe Zawadzki, so that's why, again, I'm very happy to have Joe here. And the first question is actually for you, which is, if we look at this map, we have, I think today it's about 7,000 companies in the marketing technology space. I think in 2011, we had 150 companies. So the evolution was dramatic, and you can understand the complexity for advertisers is very high. So since for us it's very difficult, I always make the example, it's like with the puzzle. You need to pick the right pieces, you need to make sure that they fit together, and you have more pieces than what you need. So question is, where does MediaMath fit into this, and how are you helping advertisers to simplify and connect the different pieces?
Well, Danilo, I will thank you for the genesis there, but wanted to zoom out a little bit, and I got the blessing to do a little bit of contextualization of the sort of the evolution, and then we'll take the opportunity to sort of say, hey, where does it go from from here? Because I do see these this sense of sort of complexity and the overwhelming sense of like fragmentation and the innovation, and it's like, how does a marketer kind of make sense and navigate not just a really complicated environment, but one that you look out forwards, and it gets harder, not easier in a lot of cases, right? So you think about marketing itself. Really, the idea that technology and quantification was a critical part of marketing. If has really been something that has truly come in its own. Not just the beginning of digital 20 years ago, but I would say the last 10 years, where it's gotten to now north of half of every advertising dollar digital. And why? And right, well, why? It's because we as people obviously are now sort of born digital. Screens that were analog, now digital and sort of inherently addressable. And you saw basically companies spring up to solve niche problems at the margins, to say in a market that's growing at 25, 30% plus per year, lots of opportunity, lots of change, and that is naturally attracts companies and people to go solve problems and sort of create businesses. And people, I think, don't appreciate the two vectors of change happening at the same time. One in, again, how we're changing as individuals, right? The ubiquity of smartphones in our pocket, the digital out-of-home screens that are sort of now connected, a TV environment that used to kind of resist programmatic or addressable advertising as having a scarce asset for a long time, suddenly have realized that in order to be in the growing parts of the marketing budget, that they needed to take their technical capabilities and sort of map them to business, right? And sort of now you see TV, for example, just 2 years ago was still lean back and hesitant, and now is decidedly part of sort of the omni-channel sort of advertising sort of market. And one thing that having sort of lived through this 20 years is this industry never got designed, right? This industry evolved, right? And it is now the reflection of, call it 20 years, of, in a lot of cases, many-to-many connections between individual companies without sort of a guiding hand. And obviously, in the Lou, people will hear from later today, but he and I have talked a lot from Bank of America about one of the challenges in our industry is the absence of a strong set of trade associations that can both define and then audit behavior. They can recommend, they can cajole, they can create standards, but the implementation and the adoption of those things is largely left up to the industry to define. So where are we now? Well, now we're in this fascinating place in this industry where there's never been more opportunity, right? The idea that a marketer needs to reach its consumers through digital is like, duh, of course. That's because that's where we are. The fact that marketing has become such an important and critical part of how a company survives, right? In a global business where distribution has changed, where some of the traditional moats have eroded in terms of what makes a company special and great. P&G, obviously, it's not just the Unilever, but it's the host of DTC companies that are sort of born digital that are the challengers in this sort of new world. I promise I'll shut up and land this plane in a second, folks. But then I'll sit quietly and be equally a good listener. So thank you. Is this like fascinating moment? And you saw for a lot of marketers, you're faced with two really tough choices. And on one side, it's this eye chart of logos that in a lot of cases, a marketer with their agency or their agencies for a global business needs to rationalize, tens of thousands of companies in dozens of categories and basically make them talk to each other in a way that ultimately drives business goals, right? And that's a challenge, right? That's a lot of work and effort in order to be a systems integrator oneself. And on the other side is the scale and simplicity and the allure of like, oh, let's give it to a Google, let's give it to a Facebook, which obviously drives current metrics, but I think for a lot of marketers is scary in the fragility it creates in a business to say, I'm renting my customers, I'm renting my media access, I'm not building something that is durable because if an algo changes or the policy changes, the thing that I did yesterday no longer works for me tomorrow. And that's often very scary, right? Certainly it's been scary for the media owners and the publishers that have been reliant on intermediaries for traffic. So here we are, finally, to your point, Danilo, what are we trying to do about it? Well, MediaMath is trying to, both as a company, but then as a catalyst to this sort of industry rationalization that we kind of need right now to thread these twin motivators of fear and greed at massive scale, is basically to say, hey, if you were to redesign the industry from first principles, if you were to re-articulate how this industry should have been designed, had we known how big it was going to be, how impactful and important it was going to be, how would you design it as if it was happening from scratch? And whether it's addressability, whether it's about accountability, whether it's about alignment, this source initiative that we've been spearheading for over the past year is really that attempt to basically say, take this, rationalize it, find the third way between crazy immature fragmentation and closed opacity on the other side, and basically try to bring the connection between a brand and consumer up into an enterprise-grade set of rails. That's basically what we do. On Wednesday.
So how many of you have been having these discussions in overall last agency reviews or even internal discussions? So the interesting part is that while we spend a lot of time talking about data and tech and analytics again, there are statistics talking about, I think there is one from the Advertiser Association talking about advertising hitting a low record on favorability for consumers. It's at 25%. And another statistic that was very interesting, I found it a couple of weeks ago, it was talking about YouTube user being the happiest 1 second before the skip button appearing. So with that said, the question I think that all of us need to ask ourselves is, how can we reinvent advertising as a force for good? That's why actually question for you, Amy. What do you think are the steps we need to take, and what is the role of Good Loop in all of this?
So I started my career at Ogilvy. It's a creative agency. And as part of working at Ogilvy, you get drilled into you the kind of Ogilvy quotes. And there's one that I've always found very telling, which was David Ogilvy once said that billboards are the worst form of advertising. He said that when you have an ad in a bus shelter, it's paying to keep your head dry. And when you have an ad in a newspaper, it's paying for journalists. But when you have an ad on a billboard, it's just selling you crap, and it's not paying for anything. And I think that kind of sums up how we should think about making advertising a force for good in the world. It's how can advertising contribute to society in positive ways? So when thinking about your question, I came up with kind of 3 categories where I think advertising can positively contribute to society. The first is through behavior change. The first is through the content we create and the stories we tell. And if we advertise electric cars and the benefit of electric cars, we can change consumer behavior and fundamentally change the way society operates. So that's a massive opportunity and a massive responsibility. The second way advertising can be a force for good is through the dollars that advertisers spend. We think a lot about conscious consumerism as an individual with dollars in their wallet deciding to buy Tom's shoes versus some crappy shoes at Walmart. And that's conscious consumerism at an individual level. It's taking ethical, social decisions and acting on it through my wallet. And advertisers can do that. When they decide to advertise on, some of the news platforms that we've heard speak today are talking about integrity and trust and real quality journalism. And advertising funds that, and that's super important. And the third way that I think advertising can contribute positively to society is by remembering that behind the eyeballs is a whole human, and they are people that can be partners, and they are not targets. So how can we be respectful with their data? How can we always give them a skip button? Because they deserve to have the choice. And how can we make advertising more collaborative? That's what I would say would be kind of the 3 key things that we should focus on.
Thank you, Amy. And so we move from the tech, so the science, to the art. I was very happy to have Max here as well as a speaker, because when I learned about emotion AI, I was like, okay, what is that? So I understand emotion AI is a technology that helps detect people's emotion. So when I read first time about it, I was like, oh, it looks like Black Mirror. Do you know Black Mirror? Okay. So that's why when I was reading it, I was thinking, oh, this is potentially a gold mine for advertisers, because, most of us are focused on efficiency, so how to get to more consumers with lower budget. But what about effectiveness? How do we make sure that we actually increment the ability of selling our products? And that's why I think emotion AI could be a very powerful tool, but there are risks. So question is, how do we mitigate those risks? Because I know emotion AI is also banned in some countries. So how do we make sure that we are respectful of privacy and so on?
Mm-hmm. So Realize uses computer vision and facial coding. So you see an example of a face coordinates that we use to measure in real time passively the major emotions uncovered by the psychologist Paul Beckman years ago. And this happens frame by frame through videos. And just from a privacy and protection standpoint, everything is opt-in. So that it's completely opt-in. There's no surveillance. There's a lot of misguided headlines, but it's something that facial coding can actually be super, super helpful for creating a better experience. And if you I think it's helpful to look at the trajectory of marketing over several years. The 1950s was the advent of mass marketing through broadcast, and the 1990s brought in the age of targeting. We figured out how to target everybody, so there's sort of diminishing returns now. You sort of exhausted targeting. And the 2010s brought in personalization, which is great in a lot of ways, and some of the most valuable companies in the world. The common thread is that they've created very personalized experiences. But they've also resulted in some cases, technology invasion, privacy invasion, and so we're really moving into the age of experience now. And so what AI and tools like facial coding have the power to do is, on a massive scale, understand human resonance so you can create very good experiences. One of the points that David Edelman made on a slide earlier today is that the importance of mindfulness and mindfulness and well-being. And one of the greatest influences on a person's well-being is the content that they're experiencing, the experience that they have based off the content. So Emotion AI can be a powerful tool for advertisers to actually be ethical and create experiences which do things like create positive appraisal sensations, which is a core biological state associated with well-being. So, and it can really help advertisers get out of the business of putting out garbage. All the highlight reels from all the CMOs today pretty much showed their 10% of tentpole content. And there's this whole other 90% of content which goes pretty much unaccounted for. And that's because you have regionalized messaging, one-day promotions, but that's the 90% of the content that advertisers are creating, which creates all the experience, and it's going largely unaccounted for, and it's accounting for roughly what we see is about half of all the media distribution dollars from advertisers. So half goes to tentpole, your Super Bowl ads, half goes to this long tail of stuff that has almost no measurement and accountability for human resonance and the impact it has on our emotions and how we feel. So the promise of AI and Emotion AI is that the automation of understanding human resonance can enable tremendous scale where we don't have an excuse anymore to put out a bunch of garbage that makes us feel bad, makes us want to skip the ad, and it can really enable us to have much greater alignment with the positive aspect that we want to bring in the experience.
Thank you, Max. Mm-hmm. How many of you have seen this before? It's quite old, actually. So basically, this is, some people call it the digital Games of Thrones. So you have the GAFA with Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. And if you look at the advertising side of it, so the first three people, I think there are statistics saying that they grew in the last few years on average 20% year on year. And then on the other side, there are the challengers. So there are, for example, DSPs. Few of them grew 50% year on year. And overall, we see a big consolidation in the market. So question to Joe is, should advertisers feel comfortable with such a consolidation of power? Because it seems like this is a winner-take-all market. Question number one. And number two is, as a DSP, what are you doing to make sure that you are on the winner side?
Yeah, so no, I think this current state of the market, I think, is it's a necessary way station. So it's as a result of that sense of I must do something because I need digital advertising to work for my core business, and I have to find a small number of companies that I can work with in order to drive those goals at scale on one hand, and with enough recognition of how hard all this stuff is at the other. So the tension between sort of scale and simplicity, I think, is what has kind of led us to the current state of the of the market. To your point, DSPs sort of occupy an interesting place. On one hand, our job is to create sort of connections across the tens of thousands of media owners, technology companies, data companies, in order to drive equivalent scale to the quote sort of walled gardens, but to do it in a way that the marketer owns, right? And it's something that they're sort of building on top of. In the fast forward to 2 years, there's no reason why walled gardens need remain walled, right? They are. It's really around the the 65% of the market that is the sort of small and mid-sized business that is quite satisfied with a easy user interface where you plug in your goals, out get results, the long-term ability to sort of make that flexible, make it customizable, and ultimately kind of have control over the supply chain. Most marketers, right, until you get to the Fortune 2000, it's a little like, that's not my problem. That's not my problem now, right? I'm more focused on, am I building the right product? I'm more focused around, do I have the right people in the organization, right? It's only when you get to a certain, sense of maturity where you've got, agency partners, where you've got substantial internal teams, where you've had to deal with the fact you've got silos between a, branding team and an acquisition team, and you've got channel by channel budgets. Like, that's an inherent consequence of scale, and some of what's happened in the in this in sort of walled gardens and the Facebooks and the Amazons and the Googles is really around how do you respond to that and make it easy to move lots of volume fairly simply. Where it needs to go to, obviously, is the third order, where those things all become part of the same fabric. Right. The reality is that we as people are touch Facebook, touch Amazon, touch Google, but we also touch The Guardian, and we're also on CNN, and we're working with media both in the paid form, but also in all of the earned and owned touch points that will be increasingly ubiquitous. Right. I thought it was interesting. David's omni-channel, if you looked at it, includes what happens at the pharmacy. Right? So, his view of media is, it is where I interact with a human being, with a consumer, regardless of where that person is. And more of those things are digital, and more of those things need to be connected from a brand's ability to have a conversation and to do it in a way that the consumer at the other end of those screens or those speakers of that pharmacy, storefront digital experience respects and acknowledges. So, where are we now? The two-part strategy, right? One is to make sure that that path to that independent media owner, that media creator actually works at enterprise scale, thing one. Thing two, basically provide the economic basis and the ability to make the pitch for a big Fortune 500 marketer to say, hey, this doesn't make sense for me at scale. Can we all kind of move out of local competition to appreciate that good advertising works for brands, good advertising works for consumers, and good advertising works for the connective tissue that brings them together, right? Like, if you don't have a successful Guardian, it's a problem for journalism, it's a problem for advertisers 6 months from now. So you actually, the notion that we're all sort of in a shared journey, I think has sometimes been lost in the sort of local competition or in this idea between buyer and seller. But I really do think that as an industry, the problems are profound enough and acute enough that most people are like for the marketers in the room, would you pay a publisher more if you got better results? Yes? Show of hands? Like, publishers should see that. Media owners should see that because they don't feel it, right? There's not a lot of mechanisms for a media owner to really say, I can do something different with my inventory and with my programming and with my content that will make it work better for marketers. As long as there's a trusted connection, like in the same way that a marketer has a supply chain, a media owner has a demand chain, if I could trust my advertisers that they would reward me for doing well, as opposed to beat me up solely on price, I can do things that work in the long run. And I think as an industry, I truly believe we're at that tipping point now from what was to what it must become, and it's so dangerously close. Again, I sometimes joke, 20 years in, I occasionally get goosebumps about how much there still is to do, but still how exciting it is for the marketing industry and for people to define their relationship with digital devices. It's a crazy time that we're in that business right now. Anyway, anyone else excited about it?
Thank you, Joe. And staying in the topic of walled gardens, actually this is extensively discussed in this book from Oletta, and it's a good book because it talks about the different dynamics that are going on in the media industry. It's a bit of the house of cards of media, and very interesting, basically, they talk about negative things, negative dynamics. They talk about transparency, about rebates, So the question is, when we think of doing something good for the world, so how do we look at transforming basically, where should advertisers work in this space?
You kind of touched on it already. It's this shift from focusing on volume to quality, and kind of shifting towards a more quality-driven user experience. And I think that is exactly what we need to do, is focus on the tangible proofs of success, focus on the results, right? So we all want to do good. We all want to feel warm and fuzzy inside and feel proud of our industry. And I built my business because I wanted to use ad money to fund amazing charities. That's like the reason I get out of bed. But it's not the reason a customer would buy from us. The reason a customer would buy from us is because we give an ethical incentive that delivers better engagement. It delivers better results. And we always, in every meeting I have, I'm always fighting to get back to those tangible results. I think that's the most powerful tool and weapon that we have in trying to shift any industry towards a more positive impact, is to just speak with numbers, just speak with logic, and speak through the evidence. You know, I love that The Guardian has become a B Corp, and Havas has become a B Corp, and you can see that they are starting to really own these more ethical principles. In an industry like ours, with a lunarscape like that one, having transparency and having these like principles of ethics is a USP. It's a way to stand out. And so although, yes, it is a complicated place, and yes, you may get goosebumps because there's a long way to go, that means that being ethical and having a more positive approach is a massive advantage and a massive opportunity. So, yeah, I'd say that generally, I think the industry needs to champion the evidence that when we behave in more transparent, more fair, more respectful, more positive ways, generally, we get better results in the long run.
So hopefully the next book will have positive dynamics as well. And talking about results, so one of the discussions that we had a lot lately as well, especially after the announcement from Chrome, limiting the tracking of users cross-site. We had GDPR in Europe in 2018. And so how do we think of first, second, and third-party data? Many people talk about first-party data like the silver bullet. So any advice on that, Max?
Sure. I mean, I guess the question you're asking is, what do we do in a cookieless world in GDPR? So yeah, first-party data become more valuable than they already are. Third-party, I mean, I think cookies were in many ways overrated all along to begin with. Not that they're important, but I think a bit overrated. It's almost impossible to buy an audience and actually know what you're buying. You know, it's sort of a fact. I mean, now they have, you know, there's services, for example, from Lucid. Well, they'll give a survey to verify that the audience that you're buying through third-party cookie is actually that audience, and lo and behold, you know, half the time it's not. So anyway, again, cookies important. It's going to change the landscape of that lumascape for a lot of people. But I think, you know, the industry, the ad industry, you know, is way over-indexed on targeting, and way at the expense of the most fundamental levers that you have. So while everybody's focused on targeting, everybody's targeting all the right people with all the wrong content. And I really like this. It's about a year old now, but it was a Nielsen study where they looked at 500 campaigns, and targeting was actually one of the smallest levers attributable to sales. The largest outcome, the largest influencer of sales was the content, and that was 50% of the attributable sales goes to the content. Very small sliver went to the targeting. So it's not that targeting is not important, but I think the over-indexing on targeting and marketing has led to sort of almost a forgetfulness of the content. And there's so much to gain, even on a fundamental basis, without even getting into specific niche audiences. Everyone has their consumer insights people. They want to, you know, dial down and do surveys on these very specific little segments. but there's a fundamental crap equation in content. And again, we see it, we see it in our lives, in our business all the time, where there's a huge amount of effort and resource and attention and accountability around the Super Bowl ads or the headline in the evergreen. And then there's this long tail of everything else. And if you think of like, the iceberg analogy where you have, the top and, the sticking out of the water, then you have the whole rest of it. And so you've got regional messaging, you've got social, you've got, and this is especially video, and increasingly it's becoming more interactive experiences. But I think the huge opportunity to win is going to be to start paying attention to that long tail. It may not be enough to do a sort of mindless chop up of your 30-second ad into a 6-second or a 10-second. There's a few companies that do that really, really, really well. But often what we see is sort of a forgetfulness, a blind spot on the majority of content that's creating the consumer experience. So I would say if I were working for a big brand, that I would start to pay attention to that forgotten long tail. And there's so much improvement to be made, even on a general population level. Forget about niche and targeting. That there's a lot to gain, a lot of low-hanging fruit. So creative and content is the biggest lever that you have when you start to lose control over targeting.
So we have 3 minutes left and 2 questions. So since I want to be a punctual Italian, I will ask everybody for an executive summary on first one. Actually, question is, do you know what is the most lucrative illegal activity? No guess? It's drug trafficking. Do you know what is the second one?
Advertising.
The second most lucrative illegal activity is actually ad fraud. There is an estimate that puts it at $50 billion revenue globally, and it's the easiest way to do cybercrime. So this is a big risk for advertisers. So open question to the panel is, what would be the other top risks you think advertisers should focus on?
It's interesting. It comes at a little bit of tension, actually, Max, to your point about the focus on sort of the long tail, which is really, as you sum it up, much more ability for a marketer to sort of reach people across the sum of all of the content, as opposed to the U.S., the Comscore 250, or sort of global equivalents. That said, there's going to be, I think, a little bit of pain in the short term for that sort of extended content creator, the sort of the blogger for whom it's one source of income but not one's primary source of income, because I do think that the focus and the emphasis does need to be on sort of this trusted, fewer, deeper partners with big brands and big media owners, and then the key technologies that sort of connect them, as we sort of rebuild from a foundation of mess. To basically say, look, there needs to be sort of a pristine pipe that actually works at scale and adheres to all of the properties that we as people, as human beings, would intuit would be a good idea for how a global media marketplace should be designed in terms of, again, is it okay for your phone to do X or to do Y? Those things need to be like literally litigated, not just from a regulatory standpoint, but from the fact that like marketers every day are investing their dollars and making a choice. Right, and sometimes, I was talking again at the dinner last night. This sleeping giants on one side says, "Hey, brands, like here's when your marketing dollars are investing in content that don't align to your values," and that's a real problem, right? Similarly, there's a real problem when automated systems or whitelists and blacklists starve high-quality journalism, right, and don't allow it to be funded through advertising from brands that people actually do want to hear from. So you've got this again middle path that one needs to navigate, and it doesn't happen by hope, and it doesn't happen 5 years from now. Like we've got like now to do it. So I think this idea of marketers be really, really choiceful, be very thoughtful around where your dollars are going. going, try to go up at the from CMO level to does my investments, does it reflect what I want to do from an ecosystem perspective? Does it reflect my brand? Does it pay for quality content and journalism? And then make sure that those beliefs are reflected in what is happening on a day-to-day basis on the ground. It is super hard, but I think it is super urgent.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about having that premium pipe. I think David Ogilvy would agree with you as well. And there are some really interesting solutions that I'm seeing. I recently met with the people behind NewsGuard. I think it's bigger here in the US, but it's just coming to the UK. The whole thing is they give a nutrition label on content, so you can see really quickly where is this sourced from, has it been checked, how good are they historically at correcting themselves when they make mistakes. And through those simple metrics, we can start to put a little bit more structure around that quite nebulous idea of a high-quality pipe at the top. I think another key risk for the industry to think about is how we balance respecting our digital rights and our digital privacy. GDPR in the UK has made ripples, and it ultimately, I think, has made the ad industry more conscious of humans and their rights and how we track them. But it's a little bit of a one step forward, two steps back, because the solutions that are rising to the top now because of GDPR are actually tracking us by device and are actually much more pervasive. So, as things like facial recognition start to come in and GDPR starts to wipe out the cookie, I think a massive risk is going to be how do we create advertising in a respectful way?
As a punctual Italian, we are out of time. So I will not ask the last question, but I will just leave this here because I think it's a very interesting dynamic that I also see in the market. So I see marketeers with traditional skills, brand managers, on the other side, tech companies that have digital tech peoples. So you have engineers and marketeers that kind of sometimes talk past each other. So I will let you read this, but thank you so much to the panelists. It was great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.